Igor Severino, The Bite. April 2024, Las Vegas, UFC Fight Night. Igor Severino was making his UFC debut, a 20-year-old Brazilian flyweight unbeaten in 8 fights, with the kind of raw speed and aggression that makes matchmakers keep an eye on you. Opposite him was fellow newcomer Andre Lima, a striker with a Muay Thai base, looking to make a name for himself the same night. The fight was competitive in the opening minutes. Severino came forward, shooting takedowns, grinding against the fence. Lima defended, firing knees. It was standard high-paced flyweight work until the moment that froze the arena. Pinned against the cage, Severino buried his face into Lima's left arm and bit down. Not a graze, not an accidental clash of teeth in a scramble, a full, visible, jaw-clamped bite. Lima ripped his arm away and immediately showed the referee the mark, a distinct semicircle of teeth on his bicep. The cameras caught it instantly. The crowd gasped. Referee Chris Tognoni halted the action. After a quick check, there was no question. This wasn't something you could let them fight through. Severino was disqualified on the spot. It was the first time in modern UFC history that a fighter had been caught biting in the cage. The Nevada State Athletic Commission reviewed the footage, suspended him 9 months, and fined him 25% of his purse. But the UFC didn't wait for that. Dana White released Severino from the roster immediately after the fight. Severino later told Brazilian outlet Combate that he didn't remember the bite at all, claiming he was dazed from a strike and must have done it on autopilot. The explanation didn't help. The image of that red indented bite mark had already gone viral. Andre Lima went straight from the octagon to get the bite mark tattooed, a permanent reminder of the strangest moment of his career. The UFC even leaned into the absurdity, gifting Lima a bite of the night bonus, an impromptu $50,000 check for winning in one of the most bizarre ways possible. For Igor Severino, it was the opposite. A debut that could have launched a career instead became a one-night UFC stint, remembered for all the wrong reasons. Ottman Azaitar, the Fight Island bag. January 2021, Abu Dhabi. The UFC was deep into its COVID-era operations. Strict bubbles, daily testing, closed hotels, and one of the most secure athlete lockdowns in sports. This was Fight Island, the company's pandemic crown jewel, a logistical fortress where nothing came in or out without approval. Ottman Azaitar, an undefeated Moroccan lightweight nicknamed the Bulldozer, was scheduled to fight Matt Frevola at UFC 257 for a 13-0 prospect with 2 UFC first-round knockouts. This was a big showcase. A win here would put him firmly on the contender radar. Then came the bag. According to Dana White, Azaitar cut off his official UFC-issued wristband, the key that allowed fighters through the secure perimeter, and gave it to an associate outside the bubble. That man then infiltrated the hotel complex in Mission Impossible fashion, climbing over 4 balconies from the outside of the building to reach Azaitar's room. In his hands, a mysterious bag. To this day, no one outside Azaitar's circle knows exactly what was inside. Dana White called it a bag of whatever the hell it was and left it at that. Social media theories ranged from supplements to food to contraband, but the UFC never confirmed. What they did confirm was the punishment. Within hours, Azaitar's fight was canceled, his corner team was removed from the premises, and the UFC announced his contract was terminated for violating COVID safety protocols and endangering the event. It was a stunning fall, from rising prospect to out of the UFC without throwing a punch. Months later, the company quietly reinstated him, but the damage to his reputation stuck. Diego Sanchez, the medical records call. Diego Sanchez was supposed to leave the UFC like a folk hero, the first Ultimate Fighter winner, a 16-year veteran, a man who fought anyone, anywhere, for almost 2 decades. Instead, it ended with a phone call. By 2021, Sanchez was in the twilight of his career, slower, battle-worn, but still stubborn. He'd split from longtime gyms and coaches, replacing them with a single figure, Joshua Fabia, the School of Self-Awareness founder, a man with no credible fight record, but plenty of strange training footage, hanging upside down while Fabia struck him, chasing teammates with a knife during drills. Corner advice that sounded like performance art. The partnership was already making headlines for the wrong reasons when Fabia made a move that ended everything. Days before Sanchez's fight with Donald Cowboy Cerrone, Fabia contacted the UFC. He didn't ask for new gloves, a rule clarification, or even an opponent change. He asked for every medical record Diego Sanchez had ever had with the company. Neurological tests, brain scans, anything dating back back to his first fight in 2005, when UFC Chief Business Officer Hunter Campbell asked why, Fabia hinted at long-term effects from Diego's career and cited them as the basis for his request. It didn't take much reading between the lines. To the UFC, this sounded like the setup for a lawsuit. If Sanchez was medically unfit to fight, they wouldn't clear him. If his own team was raising those concerns, they weren't going to put him in the octagon. The Cerrone fight was canceled. Diego Sanchez was released from his contract. In the days that followed, Sanchez would later admit that Fabia's influence had isolated him, strained his relationships, and damaged his standing in the sport. Jesse Taylor, the second chance that lasted 3 months. Jesse Taylor's UFC story is proof that sometimes the hardest fight isn't in the cage. It's keeping your own career from self-destructing. He first appeared in 2008 on The Ultimate Fighter, Team Rampage vs. Team Forrest. A big, relentless wrestler with a workhorse style, Taylor stormed through the competition and made it to the finale. One win away from a UFC contract. Then came the Vegas incident. Days before the finale, Taylor went out celebrating. Witnesses said he kicked out a limousine window, harassed guests, and set off hotel alarms. Security called Dana White, and instead of fighting for the six-figure contract, Taylor sat across from Dana and TUF host Forrest Griffin as they told him he was out of the UFC before he'd ever made his official debut. Most fighters would fade into regional obscurity after that. Taylor didn't. He spent the next 9 years fighting anywhere that would have him, from Australia to Russia, racking up over 30 wins. By 2017, he'd earned something almost no fighter gets, a second chance. That year, the UFC brought him back for The Ultimate Fighter, Redemption, a season built around veterans getting another shot. Taylor embraced it. He won the show, dominated Diego Lima in the finale, and held the $250,000 prize check in his hands. A fairy tale comeback. 9 years in the making. It lasted 3 months. Before his next fight, Taylor tested positive for clomiphene, a banned substance often used as part of a steroid cycle. USADA handed him a 1-year suspension. The UFC cut him. 9 years to rebuild a bridge, 90 days to burn it down again. Kalib Starnes, the Running Man fight. April 19, 2008, UFC 83, Montreal. Kalib Starnes was a Canadian middleweight fighting in front of a home crowd. Across the cage was Nate Quarry, a power puncher with a fan-friendly style. On paper, it was a classic striker versus striker matchup. What happened became one of the most ridiculed performances in UFC history. From the opening bell, Starnes circled, then he circled more, then he circled some more. Anytime Quarry stepped forward, Starnes stepped back, sometimes sprinting entirely out of range. The boos started early, echoing through the Bell Center. They didn't stop. By round 2, Quarry began openly mocking him, doing exaggerated running man dance steps mid-fight, grinning at the crowd. Starnes still didn't engage. His offense over 3 rounds amounted to just a handful of landed strikes. The judges didn't need to be consulted. The real verdict came from UFC president Dana White. Days later, Starnes was released from the promotion. White said flatly that he should find a new line of work. Starnes claimed afterward that a broken foot in the first round had forced him to fight defensively, but the optics were already cemented. In highlight reels, GIFs, and MMA forums, he wasn't the guy with the injury, he was the guy who ran for 15 minutes. Matt Riddle refusing to quit weed. Matt Riddle's UFC run started with real promise. The Ultimate Fighter product from Season 7, he was a young, athletic welterweight with a wrestling base, a granite chin, and a knack for putting on exciting scraps. Over 4 years, he went 8-3, 1 NC in the octagon. A solid record for a mid-card fighter finding his groove. But behind the scenes, Riddle had a problem. Not his skills, not his cardio, marijuana. In 2012, after a split decision win over Chris Clements at UFC 149, Riddle failed his post-fight drug test for THC metabolites. The result was overturned to a no contest, and he was suspended for 90 days by the Alberta Commission. He came back, beat Cha Mills in February 2013, and failed another drug test for marijuana. 2 failed tests in 7 months. The second one was the end. Riddle argued it was medically prescribed for chronic pain, and that commissions were being hypocritical for allowing testosterone replacement therapy TRT exemptions at the same time. He also claimed marijuana didn't enhance performance and that he fought better without it, but admitted he wasn't willing to stop. The UFC's stance was blunt. There are only a few scheduled tests per year, and if you can't stay clean for those, you don't belong on the roster. Dana White said publicly that Riddle was so weak-minded and so addicted to marijuana that he couldn't pass 3 tests a year. The cut stung for fans who liked Riddle's fighting style, but in the pre-legalization MMA world, commissions still treated cannabis as a performance inhibitor and a banned substance. Ironically, years later, most major athletic commissions would remove marijuana from their prohibited lists entirely, meaning the rule that cost Matt Riddle his UFC career doesn't even exist in the same way today. Renato Babalu Sobral holding the choke after the tap. By 2007, Renato Babalu Sobral was a seasoned light heavyweight veteran, a former title challenger who had fought the likes of Fedor Emelianenko, Dan Henderson, and Chuck Liddell. He carried old-school grit and a reputation for toughness. At UFC 74, he was booked against David Heath. A step down in competition meant to get Babalu back in the win column after 2 consecutive losses. The fight itself wasn't close. Babalu dominated, busting Heath open early with elbows. Then in the second round, he locked in an anaconda choke. Heath tapped. The referee moved to stop the fight, but Babalu didn't let go. He held the choke for several extra seconds, putting Heath unconscious. The crowd instantly turned on him, booing as Heath lay on the canvas. When Joe Rogan confronted him in the post-fight interview about the late release, Babalu doubled down. He said Heath had disrespected him at the weigh-ins and that he had held it until he was out on purpose. That was it. Dana White cut him before the next UFC event, calling it unacceptable and saying you can't have guys doing that. Athletic commissions took notice too. Incidents like this became part of why modern referees are quick to physically pull fighters off when a tap happens. Babalu would go on to have a lengthy career outside the UFC, but the image of him squeezing a choke on an already tapping opponent remains one of the clearest examples of how to get fired from the promotion in a single move. Jeff Molina betting scandal fallout. On paper, Jeff Molina looked like a rising flyweight to watch. A product of Dana White's Contender Series, he set a UFC record for most strikes attempted in a single round during his debut, and started his octagon career 3-0. But his success was tied to a gym and a coach whose name would soon become radioactive in MMA, James Krause, head of Glory MMA and Fitness. In November 2022, the Nevada State Athletic Commission flagged suspicious betting activity on a fight between Krause's fighter Derek Minner and Shaila Nurdanbieke. Minner entered the fight with a pre-existing injury, was quickly stopped, and betting lines had swung hard in Nurdanbieke's favor hours before the event. The investigation suggested inside information had been used to place bets, a serious violation in regulated sports. It got worse. Krause was alleged to be running an online betting group advising members on MMA wagers, including fights involving his own fighters, and working with offshore sportsbooks in ways that could breach gambling laws. The UFC's response was blunt. Any fighter who continued to train with Krause or anyone from his gym would be banned from UFC competition while the investigation was ongoing. Jeff Molina was one of Krause's main fighters. Initially suspended because of his affiliation, Molina was later named as someone the Nevada Commission wanted to investigate directly for potential involvement in the scheme. Until that was resolved, they wouldn't license him to fight. Without the ability to compete and with the case hanging over his head, the UFC removed Molina from its active roster. Hector Lombard punching after the bell. Hector Lombard arrived in the UFC in 2012 as one of the most hyped free agents in MMA. A former Bellator middleweight champion and Olympic judoka for Cuba, he carried fight-ending power and a reputation for explosive starts. But by March 2018, Lombard's UFC run was in freefall. He'd lost 5 straight heading into a welterweight bout with CB Dollaway at UFC 222, a fight he desperately needed to win to save his roster spot. It ended in the most preventable way possible. As the first round closed, the horn sounded. Dollaway relaxed, expecting to walk back to his corner. Lombard didn't. He unleashed a rapid 2-punch combination, a left-right that floored Dollaway after the bell. The referee immediately stepped in, waving the fight off. The result was a disqualification win for Dollaway. Lombard's explanation afterward was that he thought the referee had yelled stop after he'd thrown the punches, but the Nevada Commission wasn't buying it. The DQ loss marked his 6th consecutive defeat in the UFC. He got one more fight later that year, lost again, and was released from the promotion. It wasn't the first time a fighter had thrown late shots in the UFC, but Lombard's came at a moment when his career was hanging by a thread, and it snapped instantly. Muin Gafurov, sucker punch before the fight. In MMA, bad blood sells, but the fight is supposed to happen inside the cage, under the referee's watch. Muin Gafurov broke that rule before his UFC bout even began. In May 2024, Gafurov was set to face Manel Kape in a high-stakes flyweight matchup. The tension had been building for weeks, fueled by trash talk and previous confrontations. 4 weeks out, the two crossed paths at the UFC Performance Institute. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and a brief scuffle broke out. Security separated them, but the grudge clearly hadn't cooled. Then came fight week. Backstage at the UFC event, Gafurov approached Kape, saying he wanted to take a picture to clear the air. As Kape leaned in, Gafurov sucker punched him. Security swarmed instantly, pulling the two apart before a full brawl erupted in the hallway. The UFC isn't in the business of promoting unsanctioned fights in hotel lobbies. Dana White and the matchmaker saw it as a clear violation of the UFC's code of conduct. After the actual fight, which turned out to be lackluster, Gafurov was quietly removed from the roster. The irony, fighters often get paid more for pre-fight animosity, but Gafurov's over-the-line shot cost him his entire UFC career before it ever had a chance to build.